My name is Brianna. I am 23 years old, and for 23 years, I lived as a ghost in a house that was supposed to be my home. Every single morning, while the world was still draped in the silence of pre-dawn, my alarm would shriek at exactly 5 a.m. There were no gentle wake-up calls, no sunlight streaming through windows. My reality was a windowless concrete basement in Fairfield County, Connecticut, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in America. While my brother Brandon slept until noon on high-thread count sheets in his master suite, I was already on my hands and knees, scrubbing floors until my knuckles bled. My parents, Gerald and Donna Patterson, had ingrained a philosophy into me from the moment I could understand speech. They told me that the world was divided into two types of souls, those born to be served and those born to serve. You, Brianna, they would say with cold, clinical detachment, are the second kind. This is your purpose. This is your fate. I never dared to question it. Why would I? I had been homeschooled in isolation while Brandon attended a $45,000 a year private academy. I learned to read from discarded magazines and learned math by counting the change from grocery runs. I was a prisoner who didn't know she was in a cell until the morning of Brandon's wedding, the day my entire world began to unspool. That morning was a frantic blur of labor. I was steaming Victoria Whitmore's $12,000 Vera Wang gown, my hands trembling as the hot mist rose around me. Donna stood in the doorway, draped in silk, watching me like a hawk. "Don't touch the beadwork, Brianna," she warned, her voice sharp as a razor. "That dress is worth more than your entire life." But the real shift happened later, at the Ritz-Carlton. I wasn't there as a guest. I wasn't even there as the troubled sister they sometimes pretended I was. I was there as a member of the waitstaff, carrying a silver tray of champagne, instructed to stay invisible and never speak unless spoken to. I was moving through the crowd of Connecticut aristocracy when I felt a pair of eyes burning into me. It was Richard Whitmore, the father of the bride, a man worth $47 million. He wasn't looking at my tray. He was staring at my face with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. As the family gathered for photos, the photographer asked if I was part of the family. Gerald tried to wave me away with a tight, fake smile, but Richard's voice cut through the air like a thunderclap. "Yes, she's family," he commanded, his voice shaking. He pulled me aside, his hand trembling as he touched my arm. He looked into my emerald green eyes that looked nothing like the Pattersons' sandy-haired, brown-eyed features, and whispered a question that shattered 23 years of lies. "Brianna, do you know who your real mother is?" Richard Whitmore's question hung in the air, heavy and impossible. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't know how to answer because I didn't understand the premise. I told him I lived with Mr. and Mrs. Patterson and that they had raised me since I was a baby. But Richard's face didn't soften. Instead, something broke behind his eyes, a mixture of grief and a terrifying kind of recognition. He excused himself abruptly, his hand fumbling for the phone in his pocket as he retreated toward the terrace. I stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom, still holding my silver tray. Across the room, I saw Donna watching us. Her champagne glass was frozen halfway to her lips, and for the first time in my life, I saw a flicker of genuine terror on her face. She leaned in close to Gerald, whispering urgently. When Gerald looked at me, his expression hardened into a mask of pure fury. I knew that look. It usually preceded a long, cold night in the basement. The photographer called for the family portraits to begin. The Whitmores assembled first, a cluster of elegant relatives in coordinated pastels, looking like a page from a luxury magazine. Then the Pattersons stepped up. Gerald straightened his silk tie, and Donna smoothed her $4,000 Oscar de la Renta gown. Brandon wrapped an arm around his bride, Victoria, looking like the golden boy he was raised to be. I stayed back, trying to merge with the wallpaper, but the photographer paused. He scanned the group and then pointed directly at me. "What about her?" he asked. "Is she family?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Gerald's smile tightened until it looked like a scar. Donna looked at the floor, refusing to acknowledge my existence. But before Gerald could dismiss me as the help, Richard Whitmore's voice boomed across the platform. "Yes, she is family," Richard said, his voice steady now but laced with an edge of steel. "Brianna, please come stand beside me." I felt like I was walking through deep water as I approached the group. Gerald's face flushed a deep, dangerous red, but he couldn't object. not to the man who was bankrolling his son's entire future. Richard placed a firm, steadying hand on my shoulder. "Right here," he whispered. "This is where you belong." The flash fired, capturing a picture that would eventually destroy everything the Pattersons had built. As soon as the photographer moved on, Gerald's hand clamped around my upper arm. His grip was like a vice. "Outside, now," he hissed. He pulled me through a service corridor, past the clattering of the kitchen, into a narrow, dimly lit hallway. "What did you tell him?" Gerald demanded, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of expensive whiskey. I told him I said nothing, that I only told him I lived with them. Gerald shoved me back against the wall, the crates of champagne rattling behind me. "If you say one more word to him, if you even look at him again, I will throw you out on the street with nothing," he whispered. "No money, no clothes, no identity. Without us, you don't even exist. Do you understand?" I nodded, the familiar numbness washing over me. But as I watched him walk away, I realized that for the first time in 23 years, I didn't believe him. Richard Whitmore thought I existed, and he was about to prove it. Gerald's threat should have terrified me. It usually did. But as I stood alone in that cold service corridor, his words felt hollow. "Without us, you don't even exist." I had heard that my whole life. I had no birth certificate, no social security number, no driver's license. According to the United States government, Brianna Patterson was a ghost. I returned to the ballroom, my hands trembling as I picked up a fresh tray of drinks. I tried to stay in the shadows, but I could feel Richard Whitmore's eyes following me. He wasn't just watching, he was studying me. Every time I passed his table, he looked like he was seeing a ghost of his own. The reception was in full swing. The jazz band was playing an upbeat standard, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and Wagyu beef. Brandon and Victoria were at the center of the dance floor, the perfect image of high society bliss. Gerald and Donna were busy performing their roles as the proud, successful parents, laughing with hedge fund managers and sipping vintage champagne. But I noticed something. Gerald wasn't just laughing, he was drinking heavily, and Donna's eyes were darting toward the terrace every few seconds. They were terrified. I slipped toward the back of the room to refill my water pitcher when Richard intercepted me. He didn't say a word at first. He just reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was a picture of a young woman holding an infant. The woman had dark chestnut hair and eyes the color of emeralds, eyes exactly like mine. "Do you recognize anyone in this picture?" Richard asked, his voice cracking with an emotion I couldn't name. I looked at the woman. I didn't know her, but looking at her was like looking into a mirror that didn't have any cracks. My throat closed up. I told him I didn't know who she was. "That is my sister Margaret," Richard whispered. "And the baby in her arms is her daughter, Brianna. She was taken from a hospital nursery 23 years ago. My sister spent every waking moment of the next 5 years looking for her. She died of a broken heart before she could find her." The ballroom seemed to tilt on its axis. The music became a dull roar in my ears. Richard stepped closer, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "I have a lab on standby, Brianna. A DNA kit is in my car. If I'm wrong, I will leave you alone and never mention this again. No jesli prav. If I am right, then the people in this room didn't raise you. They stole you." I looked across the room at Gerald. He was watching us now, his face contorted in a silent warning. He looked like the monster I had always known him to be. Then I looked back at the woman in the photo, the woman who looked like she would have loved me. "I'll do it," I whispered. Richard didn't waste a second. He led me through the side exit to his car. The test took less than a minute, a simple swab of the cheek. As he sealed the kit, he told me the results would be back in 72 hours. He told me to be brave, to go back inside, and to act as if nothing had happened. I walked back into the Ritz-Carlton, but I wasn't the same girl who had walked out. I looked at the Italian marble and the crystal chandeliers and realized they were all paid for with the blood of a stolen life. I was no longer a servant waiting for orders. I was a witness waiting for the truth. The next 3 days were the longest of my life. I went back to the house in Fairfield County, back to the routine that had defined my existence. I woke at 5 a.m. I scrubbed the grout in the kitchen with a toothbrush, and I prepared the organic, soft-boiled eggs Gerald demanded every morning. But everything felt different. Every time I looked at the granite countertops or the silver-trimmed china, I saw the price tag of my own kidnapping. Gerald and Donna were on edge. The house was thick with a poisonous silence. They didn't speak to me unless it was to bark an order, but I caught them whispering in the study late at night. Once, I crept to the door and heard Gerald's voice, low and jagged. He was saying something about checking the offshore accounts and whether the statute of limitations applied to acquisition. Donna was crying, not out of guilt, but out of the sheer terror of losing her status. On the second night, Donna came into the kitchen while I was polishing the silver. She stood behind me, her reflection in the window looking skeletal and gray. "You've been quiet, Brianna," she said. "Too quiet. I hope you aren't filling your head with the nonsense Richard Whitmore was spewing at the wedding. He's an old man prone to delusions. We saved you, you know. Without us, you would have been a statistic in a system that didn't want you." I didn't turn around. I just kept polishing a heavy silver spoon. "Some children are born to be served," I whispered, repeating her favorite mantra. "And some are born to serve. Isn't that what you told me?" Donna flinched as if I'd slapped her. She left the room without another word, but I heard the deadbolt on the basement door click shut earlier than usual that night. They were locking me in, sensing that the bird they had clipped for 23 years was finally growing its feathers back. I lay on my mildewed mattress in the dark, staring at the furnace. I thought about Margaret Whitmore, the woman in the photograph. I thought about her dying of grief, never knowing that her daughter was only a few towns away, being treated like a piece of furniture. I felt a cold, hard anger crystallizing in my chest. It was no longer about fear. It was about justice. On the third morning, my old Nokia phone, the one I had hidden inside a hollowed-out book, buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. The message was short. "The results are in. Meet me at the cafe on Main Street at 10 a.m. Bring nothing." I had to be careful. Donna was in the garden and Gerald was at the club. I slipped out through the basement hatch, a small window I had loosened years ago just in case of a fire. I ran. I didn't look back at the colonial house or the manicured lawn. I ran until my lungs burned, arriving at the cafe just as the clock struck 10. Richard was sitting in the back booth. He didn't have to say a word. When he saw me, he stood up, and tears began to stream down his face. He held out a manila envelope, his hand shaking uncontrollably. "It's 99.9% Brianna," he choked out. "You aren't a Patterson. You never were. You are Brianna Ashford Whitmore. You are my niece." I sank into the seat. The paper clutched in my hands. The technical jargon on the page didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the truth. The people who had raised me weren't my parents. They were my captors. And Richard wasn't just a stranger. He was my blood. But then his face went grim. "We have to go," he said, grabbing his coat. "The FBI has already been notified. They're reopening the 2003 cold case as we speak. But there's more. Your mother, Margaret, she left a trust for you. A trust that Gerald and Donna have been trying to find a way to access for years. That's why they kept you. You were their winning lottery ticket, hidden in a basement." Richard didn't take me to a police station. He took me to a secure office in downtown Greenwich, where two men in dark suits were waiting. They were FBI agents from the Crimes Against Children Task Force. They had a file on the table as thick as a phone book. It was labeled Ashford Whitmore Abduction, 2003. One of the agents, a man named Morrison, looked at me with a mix of pity and professional intensity. He explained that they had been tracking an illegal adoption ring for nearly 2 decades, a network that specialized in erasing the identities of kidnapped infants and selling them to wealthy families who didn't want to wait for legal channels. The Pattersons hadn't just found me, they had placed an order. The agents showed me a piece of evidence that made my blood run cold. It was a digital copy of a ledger found years ago during a raid on a warehouse in New Jersey. On a page dated July 2003, there was a line item: "Female infant, green eyes. Buyer, G. Patterson. Price, $15. 000. I was bought for $15,000, the price of a used car." Richard's knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the desk. He told the agents about the rules in the Patterson house, the basement, the chores, the lack of documents, the rattan cane hidden in the pantry. Agent Morrison's jaw tightened. He told me that Gerald and Donna had committed federal crimes. kidnapping, human trafficking, and document fraud. But to move forward, they needed a final piece of the puzzle. They needed the physical documents Gerald had used to hide my existence. Richard looked at me. Brianna, we believe they still have the original hospital records and the fake papers they used to move you. They probably keep them in a safe. If we can get those, they're going to prison for the rest of their lives. I knew where the safe was. It was behind a false panel in Gerald's study, hidden behind a collection of vintage leather-bound books. I had seen him open it once when he thought I was asleep in the basement. I told them I would go back. Richard immediately protested, saying it was too dangerous, that they would know something was wrong. But Agent Morrison stepped in. He told us that if I went back and acted as if everything was normal, the FBI could secure a warrant and move in within 24 hours. If I could get photos of the contents of that safe, it would be an open and shut case. I took a deep breath. For 23 years, I had played the role of the silent servant. I could play it for one more night. I returned to the house at 4 p.m. Donna was waiting in the foyer, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed. "Where were you?" she demanded, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. I told her the store was out of the specific floor wax she liked, and I had to walk to the next town. She stared at me for a long time, looking for a crack in my mask. Finally, she spat on the floor and told me to get to the kitchen. That night, the house felt like a tomb. I waited until the clock struck 2 a.m. I crept up the basement stairs, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood. I reached the study door and turned the handle. It was unlocked. I found the panel. I moved the books. My heart was beating so loud I was sure it would wake the entire neighborhood. I reached for the keypad, remembering the numbers Gerald had pressed years ago. His own birthday, followed by Brandon's. The safe clicked. The heavy steel door swung open. Inside, there was a thick blue folder. I opened it and saw a birth certificate. It didn't say Brianna Patterson. It said Brianna Ashford Whitmore. Beneath it was a hospital bracelet, still small enough to fit a tiny wrist, and a handwritten receipt from a man named the broker. I pulled out my phone to take the photos, but then the light in the hallway flickered on. "Go ahead, Brianna," a voice hissed from the doorway. "Take the pictures. It's the last thing you'll ever do." I turned around. Gerald was standing there, holding the rattan cane in one hand and a heavy iron fire poker in the other. Gerald stepped into the room, the shadow of the fire poker stretching across the mahogany floor like a jagged tooth. He didn't look like the polished Wall Street executive the neighbors knew. His hair was disheveled, his eyes were bloodshot, and he smelled of the expensive scotch he'd been using to drown his panic. He looked at the open safe, then at the blue folder in my hand, and let out a low, guttural laugh. "I always knew you were a mistake," he said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "Donna wanted a doll, but I wanted an investment. And look at you, 23 years of roof over your head, food in your stomach, and this is how you repay the people who saved you?" I didn't back down. My hands were shaking, but my voice was cold. "You didn't save me, Gerald. You bought me $15,000. I saw the ledger. You stole me from a woman who died of grief because of what you did. You didn't give me a home. You gave me a prison." Gerald's face contorted into a mask of pure hate. He lunged forward, the fire poker swinging through the air. I dove to the left, crashing into the heavy leather armchair. The poker smashed into the desk, splintering the wood where my head had been seconds before. Donna appeared in the doorway, her silk robe fluttering. "Gerald, stop!" she screamed. But she didn't move to help me. She just stood there, clutching her throat. "If the police come, if this gets out, we lose everything. The club, the estate, Brandon's career, it all goes away." "She's not going to the police," Gerald hissed. Turning back toward me, "She's going to disappear, just like her documents." He swung again, but this time I was ready. I grabbed a heavy crystal decanter from the side table and hurled it at his head. It missed, shattering against the wall, but the distraction gave me enough time to scramble toward the window. I pushed the heavy velvet curtains aside, but Gerald's hand clamped around my ankle, dragging me back onto the floor. The rattan cane came down across my shoulders, a familiar stinging pain that usually would have made me collapse. But tonight, the pain felt like fuel. I kicked out with everything I had, my heel connecting with Gerald's jaw. He grunted and slumped back, clutching his face, I grabbed the blue folder, the proof of my life, and bolted for the door. Donna tried to block my way, her manicured nails reaching for my eyes, but I shoved past her with a strength I didn't know I possessed. I didn't go for the front door. I knew Gerald would have the alarm set. I headed for the kitchen, for the servants' entrance I had used thousands of times. I burst out into the night air, the cold Connecticut wind stinging my face. I ran toward the end of the driveway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, I heard the heavy front door slam open and Gerald's voice screaming into the dark. I reached the stone gates just as 3 black SUVs roared up the quiet street, their headlights blinding me. I fell to my knees, clutching the blue folder to my chest, convinced for a second that Gerald had called his own private security to finish me off. But then, the doors flew open. Richard Whitmore was the first one out, followed by Agent Morrison and a team of armed men in tactical gear. Richard ran to me, wrapping his coat around my shivering shoulders. "I've got you, Brianna," he whispered, his voice thick with tears. "I've got you. It's over." I handed the blue folder to Agent Morrison. "Everything is in there," I whispered. "The birth certificate, the receipts, everything." As the FBI team swarmed the house, the quiet neighborhood was shattered by the sound of Donna's hysterical screaming and the sharp metallic click of handcuffs. The red and blue lights of the police cruisers danced across the white columns of the Patterson estate, turning the symbol of their wealth into a crime scene. I sat in the back of Richard's car, wrapped in a blanket, watching through the window as the life I had known disintegrated in real time. Agent Morrison and his team didn't move with the hesitation of a normal search. They moved with the precision of a strike team. Gerald was led out first, his face pressed against the gravel of the driveway as he was cuffed. He wasn't the powerful executive anymore. He was just a middle-aged man in a wrinkled undershirt, screaming about his lawyers and his rights until an agent pushed his head down into the back of a transport van. Donna followed minutes later. She wasn't screaming. She was silent, her eyes wide and vacant as she was led out in her silk robe and handcuffs. She looked at me for a split second as they passed the car, but there was no apology in her gaze, only a hollow sort of shock that the world she had built on a foundation of theft had finally tilted on its axis. Within an hour, the FBI had cleared the house, carrying out boxes of evidence, including the rattan cane from the pantry and the computer towers from Gerald's study. They found more than just my records. They found evidence of Gerald's offshore accounts and the trail of money he had been laundering to keep the estate afloat. The most devastating moment, however, was when Brandon and Victoria pulled up to the gates. They had been at a post-wedding brunch and arrived to find their family home cordoned off with yellow tape. Brandon jumped out of his BMW, looking confused and angry, demanding to know why the police were at his father's house. Richard stepped out of the car and met him halfway. I watched through the glass as Richard handed Brandon a copy of the DNA results and the FBI summary. Brandon's face went through a terrifying transformation, from arrogance to confusion, and finally to a pale, sickly realization. He looked at the house, then at the van where his parents were being held, and then at me. He took a step toward the car, but Agent Morrison blocked his path. Brandon didn't fight it. He just stood there, the golden boy of Fairfield County, realizing that his entire life, his education, his car, even the ring on Victoria's finger, had been funded by the exploitation of a girl he called a servant. Victoria didn't even wait for him. She saw the FBI jackets, read the room, and got back into her own car, driving away without a single word to her new husband. The Whitmore family had officially severed the tie. Richard took me to his home in Greenwich that night. It wasn't a basement. It was a suite with windows that looked out over the Long Island Sound. For the first time in 23 years, there was no deadbolt on my door. There was no 5 a.m. alarm. But as I lay in the oversized bed, the silence felt heavier than the hum of the furnace ever had. I realized that while Gerald and Donna were in a cell, I was still learning how to be free. The truth had set me free, but it had also left me with the wreckage of a life I had to rebuild from scratch. The trial of Gerald and Donna Patterson became a national sensation, a dark fairy tale of the digital age that stripped away the veneer of Connecticut's elite. I sat in that courtroom every single day, not as a victim, but as the primary witness for the United States government. I watched from the stand as their defense team tried to paint them as desperate parents who only wanted to save a child from a broken system. But the evidence was insurmountable. The FBI had traced the money, found the digital correspondence with the broker, and documented 2 decades of systemic abuse. Gerald was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Donna received 12. As they were led away, Gerald finally looked at me, his eyes still burning with a cold, unrepentant resentment. I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt nothing at all. Brandon's fall was just as steep, though he faced no criminal charges. Richard Whitmore made sure of that. Within weeks, Victoria had filed for an annulment, her lawyers citing the fraudulent nature of the family she had married into. Brandon lost his job, his car, and his social standing overnight. He called me once from a burner phone, his voice shaking, asking if I could use my influence with Richard to help him get a fresh start. I told him the same thing Gerald had told me for 23 years, that actions have consequences and that some people are born to face the truth alone. I hung up and changed my number. I wasn't his servant anymore, and I owed him no more of my life. Rebuilding myself was the hardest part. Richard stood by me through every panic attack and every moment of doubt. He helped me navigate the legal process of reclaiming my real identity, Brianna Ashford Whitmore. I had to learn how to exist in a world where I wasn't defined by chores or fear. I started with the basics, getting my first driver's license, enrolling in a bridge program for my high school diploma, and eventually being accepted into a university to study psychology. I wanted to understand the minds of people who could do what the Pattersons did, and more importantly, how to help the people they leave behind. The inheritance my mother Margaret had left for me was vast, but I used the majority of it to establish the Margaret Ashford Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to cold case abductions and supporting survivors of domestic trafficking. I didn't want the money to be a reminder of my price tag. I wanted it to be the key to someone else's cage. Richard and I eventually moved to a quiet estate in California near where my mother had lived, finally putting 3,000 miles between us and the basement in Connecticut. I still wake up at 5 a.m. sometimes. The habit of 23 years is hard to break, but now when I open my eyes, I don't see concrete walls or feel the vibration of a furnace. I see the sunrise over the Pacific Ocean. I make a cup of coffee exactly how I like it, and I sit at a table that has plenty of room for me. I look at the photograph of Margaret that now sits on my mantle, the woman who never stopped loving me, even when I didn't know she existed. I am no longer the girl born to serve. I am Brianna, I am a Whitmore, and for the first time in my life, I am home.